The crisp autumn air brushed against my face as I stepped out of the university building, a faint smile tugging at the corners of my lips. In one hand, I clutched my phone, its screen glowing with the image of my latest grade straight A's. My heart swelled with pride, but beneath it lay an uneasy tension, a quiet dread that gnawed at me like a persistent shadow. Will Mom be proud of me today? Or will she only see the numbers at the bottom? I thought to myself, trying to steady my racing pulse. The truth was, I already knew the answer. Deep down, I'd always known. But somehow, I still let myself hope that maybe, just this once, things would be different. When I pushed open the door to our house, the familiar scent of stale coffee and polished wood greeted me. The living room was dimly lit, the heavy curtains drawn shut as if to shield us from the outside world, or perhaps to keep something inside. Vanessa, my mother, sat stiffly on the sofa, her sharp features illuminated by the pale glow of her laptop screen. Her eyes flickered up briefly before returning to whatever spreadsheet she was obsessing over. Brandon, my older brother, sprawled lazily beside her, scrolling through his phone with disinterest etched across his face. The air in the room felt suffocating, thick with unspoken resentment and unresolved grievances. It wasn't unusual. This oppressive atmosphere had been my constant companion growing up. Still, I braced myself and cleared my throat. Finally home. Huh? Vanessa said without looking up, her tone dripping with disdain. What do you want? I hesitated for a moment, clutching the strap of my backpack tighter. For all her coldness, she was still my mother, the woman who gave birth to me, raised me, shaped me into who I am today. And yet, standing there, I couldn't help but feel like a stranger in my own home. I got my grades back, I began, forcing my voice to remain steady. Straight A's. At that, Vanessa finally looked up, her piercing gaze locking onto mine. There was no warmth in her expression, no hint of pride or approval. Instead, her lips curled into a sneer, and she slammed a piece of paper onto the coffee table between us. Is this what you came here to brag about? She snapped, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. I'm done wasting money on you. If you're not gonna make something of yourself, I'm pulling your tuition. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me momentarily breathless. I stared at her, my mind reeling. All those sleepless nights studying, all the sacrifices I'd made to excel academically, and this was how she responded? Not with encouragement, not even with indifference, but with outright hostility. For a brief second, I felt the sting of betrayal, the kind that cuts deeper than any physical wound. But then, something shifted within me. A spark of defiance ignited in my chest, burning away the hurt and replacing it with icy resolve. Go ahead, I said coolly, leaning back against the chair opposite her. I already paid it all off. The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging heavily in the air. Vanessa's eyes widened in shock, her perfectly manicured fingers freezing mid-motion. Even Brandon, who rarely showed any interest in anything, gaped at me like I'd just announced I was an alien. From somewhere deep inside, I found a twisted satisfaction in their stunned expressions. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment when the tables turned. When I stopped being the helpless child they could control, and became someone they couldn't ignore. The silence that followed my revelation was deafening. A vacuum of sound where only the weight of my words lingered. Brandon's jaw hung open like a broken hinge, his eyes darting between me and Vanessa as if trying to piece together some puzzle. He didn't fully understand. Vanessa, on the other hand, looked as though someone had just punched her in the gut. Her perfectly composed exterior cracked for a fleeting moment before she masked it with disbelief. Wait, you had money all this time? Brandon finally stammered, breaking the suffocating quiet. His tone was incredulous, but there was also an undertone of accusation, like I'd somehow betrayed them by keeping secrets. I leaned back in my chair, crossing one leg over the other, deliberately casual despite the storm brewing around me. My gaze shifted from him to Vanessa, who was now staring at me with a mixture of shock and fury. It wasn't the reaction I expected, not entirely. Part of me thought they might feel proud or at least impressed, but no. Instead, their faces twisted into something darker, more primal. Jealousy, resentment, greed. It's a long story, I said evenly, letting the tension stretch a little longer before continuing. But yeah, I've been working freelance jobs since sophomore year. I let my mind drift back to those early days. The memory so vivid it felt like stepping into another life. A cramped dorm room bathed in the soft glow of a flashlight because I couldn't afford a desk lamp. Paper scattered across the table, sticky notes plastered on the wall reminding me of deadlines. The faint hum of my laptop fan struggling against hours of continuous use. At first, it was small gigs writing blog posts for $10 apiece, designing logos for local businesses that barely paid enough to cover a meal. But every rejection email, every late-night hustle taught me something new. How to negotiate better rates, how to market myself online, how to spot scammers before they could take advantage of me. There were nights when exhaustion clawed at my eyelids, forcing me to choose between sleep and finishing a project. Days when clients ghosted after receiving their work, leaving me unpaid and bitter. Months when rent loomed overhead like a guillotine, threatening to cut short my education if I couldn't scrape together enough cash. But slowly, painfully, things began to change. Word spread about my reliability, my quality. Clients came back for repeat business, referred me to others. That $50 a month grind turned into $500, then $1,000 until eventually, I was pulling in $5 to $7 grand monthly, without anyone noticing, not even my own family. And yet, through it all, I kept silent. Not out of shame, but survival. I knew what would happen if Vanessa found out. She'd demand a cut, call it family responsibility. So I saved quietly, secretly paying off my tuition installment by installment while pretending to rely on her financial support. I started with $50 a month. I continued, snapping back to reality. Now I make $5 to $7 grand a month. Paid off tuition, saved over $50,000. Vanessa's face darkened further, her lips pressing into a thin line. For a split second, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Pride? No, not quite. It was greed, pure and unfiltered. And then it morphed into anger, seething and uncontrollable. And you never thought to help your own family. She exploded, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. Her words hit me like a slap, though not physically, not yet. They carried the same venomous sting, the same implication that I owed them everything simply because of blood. After everything I did for you? She added, jabbing a finger toward me. I stared at her unflinching, letting her rage wash over me like a wave crashing against a rock. Everything you did for me? I echoed, my voice low but razor sharp. You mean giving birth and expecting a return on investment? The room seemed to freeze, every word reverberating like thunder in the confined space. Vanessa's nostrils flared, her hands trembling slightly. Then, without warning, she lunged forward, her palm connecting sharply with my cheek. Smack. The sound was sharp, jarring, slicing through the air like a whip. Pain shot through my face, but I didn't flinch. Didn't move. Didn't blink. Brandon gasped audibly, his expression frozen somewhere between horror and awe. Vanessa stood there, breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling like bellows, her eyes bored into mine, searching for weakness, for submission. But she wouldn't find any. Because in that moment, I realized something profound. I wasn't afraid anymore. As the initial shock of Vanessa's slap faded, a strange calm settled over me. I could feel the shift, the balance of power tilting ever so slightly in my favor. For years, I lived under her thumb, bending to her will, enduring her criticisms. But now I had leverage. Now I had independence. Brandon broke the silence first, his voice hesitant. Dude, come on. You've got money. Just help us out a little. His plea sounded pathetic, almost desperate. And maybe that was intentional, a calculated attempt to guilt trip me into compliance. But it only solidified my resolve. No, I said firmly, standing up. Not this time. With that, I walked out of the room, leaving behind two people who had always seen me as nothing more than a tool to exploit. As I stepped outside, the cool night air greeted me like an old friend. For the first time in years, I felt free. The sting of Vanessa's slap still lingered on my cheek, a sharp reminder of the fury she had unleashed moments ago. But it wasn't enough to break me, far from it. If anything, her outburst only solidified my resolve. I stood there, unmoving, unflinching, watching as something shifted in her demeanor. The rage that had consumed her began to morph into something else entirely. Vanessa took a step back, her rigid posture softening slightly. She exhaled deeply, as if trying to compose herself, and then turned to face me with an expression I hadn't seen in years, one of feigned concern. Her voice dropped several octaves, becoming syrupy sweet, almost sickeningly so. Sweetheart, she cooed, reaching out a hand toward me but stopping short of actually touching me. I was just stressed. You know how hard things have been for me. I couldn't help but notice every tiny shift on her face, each twitch of her lips, each flicker in her eyes. She was putting on a show, and I saw right through it. Oh, so now I'm a successful genius instead of a waste of money? I cut her off mid-sentence, tilting my head ever so slightly. My tone was calm, almost amused, but laced with biting sarcasm. That's funny. Brandon, who had been quietly observing this exchange, decided it was his turn to step in. He leaned forward, adopting a casual pose meant to appear nonchalant, though his forced grin betrayed his true intentions. Yeah, man, he chimed in, his voice dripping with false camaraderie. I got this killer investment opportunity. If you chip in, we could both make bank. His words hung in the air, heavy with insincerity. I raised an eyebrow, letting silence stretch between us for a moment before responding. Help, I repeated, my voice icy. Like how mom helped me by threatening to pull my tuition. Inside, I felt a mix of disgust and pity. Disgust for their blatant attempts to manipulate me, and pity for how desperate they had become. Memories flooded back, memories of all the times I'd been made to feel worthless, like nothing more than a burden or a liability. Every snide comment, every dismissive glance, every threat cloaked in thinly veiled advice came rushing back. And yet, here they were now, pretending to care about me because they finally realized I had something they wanted. They don't love me, I thought bitterly. They never did. All they want is my money. It was a sobering realization, one that left me feeling hollow inside. For years, I clung to the hope that maybe, deep down, they cared even just a little. But now, staring at their desperate attempts to manipulate me, I knew the truth. Vanessa's carefully constructed facade cracked again, revealing the raw greed beneath. Her voice rose sharply, cutting through the room like a knife. "If you don't help, we're gonna lose everything," she screamed, her composure crumbling under the weight of her own desperation. "And it'll be your fault." Her words echoed ominously, filling the space with tension. She pointed an accusatory finger at me, her eyes wild with fury. Meanwhile, Brandon sat silently beside her, visibly uneasy but unwilling to intervene. His earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by a look of unease as he watched his mother unravel. I shrugged, deliberately casual, refusing to let her theatrics affect me. "No," I said coolly, meeting her gaze without flinching. "That would be your fault. You burned through everything, not me." The atmosphere in the room grew heavier, thick with unresolved tension. Vanessa glared at me, her chest heaving with each labored breath. It was clear she had no intention of backing down, but neither did I from the outside. The house looked eerily quiet, almost serene. But inside, the battle raged on. Vanessa's voice carried faintly through the closed windows, growing increasingly shrill with each passing second. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" She spat venomously. "You think you can just walk away after everything we've done for you?" I didn't bother responding. Instead, I grabbed my coat and headed for the door, pausing briefly to glance back at them. "There's nothing left to say," I said simply, my voice devoid of emotion. Then, without another word, I stepped outside, leaving behind the toxic environment that had shaped so much of my life. The cool night air hit me instantly, a stark contrast to the stifling tension indoors. I took a deep breath, savoring the freedom I felt for the first time in years. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going back. That night, after the explosive confrontation with Vanessa and Brandon, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with unanswered questions. Vanessa's constant complaints about hard times or her threats to pull my tuition had always felt off, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. Something wasn't adding up. I sat at my desk, the faint glow of my laptop screen casting shadows across my face. Outside, the wind howled softly, but inside, the silence was deafening. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I accessed Vanessa's bank statement. Something I'd managed to retrieve through a forgotten shared document on our family cloud account. What I found made my blood run cold. Vanessa hadn't been struggling financially, she'd been living recklessly. Thousands of dollars spent on designer handbags, luxury vacations, and failed investments that reeked of greed and poor judgment. Not a single penny went toward the family. "This isn't about providing for us, it's about her own selfishness." My hands trembled slightly as I printed out the documents. Each page felt heavier than the last, a physical weight that mirrored the betrayal I felt. Not for the family, for her greed. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple yet sharp outfit, a silent declaration that I was done being manipulated. When I walked into the living room, Vanessa and Brandon were already seated at the dining table alongside several relatives, who had gathered for what they thought would be a routine family meeting. The air was thick with polite small talk, but I could see the unease in their eyes. They weren't expecting me to show up, not after last night's blowout. Without saying a word, I stepped forward and placed a stack of papers onto the center of the table. The sound of paper hitting would echo through the room, silencing everyone instantly. Eyes widened. Mouths fell open. No one spoke. "You want to talk about loyalty?" I began, my voice steady but cutting. "About responsibility? How about you explain this?" I tapped the stack of papers for emphasis, my gaze locked onto Vanessa. This isn't what it looks like." Vanessa stammered, her composure cracking under the weight of exposure. Her voice wavered, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. Brandon leaned forward, trying to intervene. "Dude, come on. She's our mom." "No." I shot back, my tone icy and final. "She's your mom. I'm done." My words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Brandon flinched, his attempt at deflection crumbling before he could even finish. He sank back into his chair, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Vanessa, however, wasn't ready to give up. Her fear quickly morphed into fury, and she stood up abruptly, slamming her palms against the table. "I gave you life. You owe me," she screamed, her voice shaking with desperation. Without hesitation, I pulled out my phone and held it up, the camera app already open. "You want me to live stream this?" I asked calmly, though my tone carried a razor-sharp edge. "Let's see what everyone thinks about you screaming because you can't use me as your personal ATM anymore." For a moment, the room was utterly silent. Vanessa froze, her mouth half open, unable to respond. The threat of public humiliation was too much for her to bear. Brandon, sensing the tide had turned irreversibly, stood quietly and slipped out of the room without another word. As Vanessa collapsed back into her chair, defeated, I picked up the stack of papers and turned toward the door. My footsteps felt heavy, each one carrying the weight of years of manipulation, guilt trips, and endless expectations. Before stepping outside, I paused briefly and glanced back at the group. Vanessa sat motionless, her face buried in her hands. The relatives exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to say or do. "There's nothing left here for me," I said quietly, though loud enough for them to hear. Then, without looking back again, I stepped out into the crisp morning air. Standing on the porch, I took a deep breath, feeling the cool breeze brush against my skin. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. Free from the manipulation, the guilt trips, and the endless expectations. But it wasn't just freedom, it was clarity. I realized that family isn't defined by blood or obligation. Family is about love, support, and mutual respect. And none of those things existed in the house I just left behind. I drove down the long, open road, the windows rolled down to let the wind rush in. It was a crisp morning, the kind where the air feels alive with possibility. The sky stretched endlessly above me, a brilliant blue that seemed to promise freedom in its purest form. Fields of golden grass flanked either side of the highway, swaying gently in rhythm with the breeze. For the first time in years, I felt unburdened, like the weight of expectations, guilt, and manipulation had finally been lifted from my shoulders. I spent so many years hoping for something real, a family that truly cared. But now I understand that family isn't about where you come from. It's about who accepts you for who you are. The realization hit me like a wave, washing away years of doubt and resentment. Vanessa wasn't just a mother who failed me. She was a person consumed by greed and selfishness. And Brandon, he was her mirror image, too weak to stand on his own but willing to exploit anyone else to survive. My childhood had been wasted chasing approval from people who never intended to give it. But now, as I gripped the steering wheel and felt the hum of the engine beneath me, I realized I didn't need their validation anymore. I built a life for myself, one that was mine alone. It wasn't perfect and it certainly hadn't been easy, but it was honest. I pulled over to the side of the road, parking near a quiet overlook. The horizon stretched out before me, endless and vast, dotted with distant trees and rolling hills. I stepped out of the car, letting the cool air fill my lungs. There was a strange sense of peace in this moment, a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Family isn't blood, I thought to myself, staring at the horizon. Family is who actually gives a damn about you. It wasn't just a lesson, it was a truth I'd earned through pain, betrayal, and countless sleepless nights. And while I couldn't change the past, I could choose how to move forward. I sat on the hood of my car, watching the clouds drift lazily across the sky. Memories of my childhood flickered through my mind, but they no longer carried the same sting. Instead, they felt distant, like scenes from someone else's life. I remembered the times I'd stayed up late studying, hoping to make Vanessa proud. I remembered the guilt trips, the constant reminders that I owed her everything because she gave me life. And I remembered the nights I cried silently into my pillow, wondering why nothing I did was ever enough. But those memories didn't hurt anymore, not really. They were just pieces of a puzzle I'd finally solved. Vanessa wasn't capable of love, not in the way I'd always hoped for. She saw me as an investment, a tool to be used until there was nothing left to take. And when I stopped being useful, she turned on me. Still, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness, not for her, but for the years I'd lost trying to please her. Those were years I could never get back. Moments of my life spent chasing something that didn't exist. But maybe that was the price of learning this lesson. Maybe some truths can only be understood through pain. As I sat there, I made a silent promise to myself. I would never let anyone treat me like that again. From now on, I would surround myself with people who genuinely cared about me, not because of what I could do for them, but because of who I was. When I got back in the car, I hesitated for a moment before turning off my phone completely. No calls, no messages, just silence. Vanessa would try to reach out eventually, I knew that much. She'd beg, threaten, or guilt trip me into coming back, just like she always did. But this time, I wouldn't answer. This time, I was done. The road ahead was uncertain, but that didn't scare me. If anything, it excited me. For the first time, I wasn't running towards something, I was running away. Away from the toxicity, the lies, and the endless cycle of manipulation. As the miles passed beneath my wheels, I allowed myself to smile. It wasn't a big smile, just a small, content one. A smile that said, I'm free. And maybe that was enough. Family isn't blood. Family is who actually gives a damn about you. That was the lesson I carried with me as I drove toward whatever the future held. It wasn't just a mantra, it was a promise. I promised to myself that I would never settle for less than I deserved.